5 books and counting. The Tales from the Omni Vault continues to expand as a universe. Go ahead and check the links down in the description to get your copies today. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni Viewer. And this is something I've wanted to address for a little bit now, because I find it a very interesting topic, and similar to what happened with the Monsterverse Kiss video I did a little while ago, I feel like what I'm witnessing today is something I've seen happen before, and this time actually something I witnessed as it happened. Now, we're going back to Godzilla Minus One here. Now, of course, I love Godzilla Minus One, and I believe it deserves all the accolades it receives. Yet I have noticed something odd pop up every once in a while, and I haven't seen it as much recently, but for a little bit there it was pretty common. What I've noticed is that there are people who seem to have a certain resentment for Minus One, but not the way you might expect. These people might still agree that Godzilla Minus One is a well-made Godzilla movie, maybe even one of the best, but they feel a certain resentment towards it, not because of how it was made, but rather because of the impact it had. It goes something like this. Godzilla Minus One was really good, so good that it broke into the mainstream. This brought in people who had never even bothered with Godzilla movies before, who saw it and loved it, and then they started talking about it, and not all of them were necessarily on point while talking about it. Some of them, of course, admitted that they only knew so much, but some of them decided that even though they'd never seen a Godzilla movie before, or never really bothered to see them or take them as they were meant to be, they still decided to act like they were suddenly experts. And this resulted in some of the most infamously bad video essays since Doug Walker did the Nostalgia Critic review of The Wall. And from there, things just sort of deteriorated. And it became this sort of thing where Minus One was put on such a pedestal by so many people that it was poisoning the conversation. There was an automatic assumption that Minus One was so good that the monsterverse, especially Godzilla Kong the New Empire, could never possibly measure up and therefore should just fail and disappear. That other movies that preceded Minus One were all just garbage, with the exceptions of the 1954 original and Shin Godzilla, because those were the only ones people seem to remember. And it just seemed like the conversation didn't actually make sense anymore. It had skewed in such a direction that people were starting to actually feel a resentment towards Minus One for ruining the discourse. That was what I've seen people say, at least. Now, we certainly cannot deny that the discourse has, in fact, been kind of unusual as of late, let's be polite and say, with people, well, you've witnessed it all. You've seen the people who say Toho good, Monsterverse bad. You've seen people say that Minus One is so perfect that nothing could measure up to it. You've seen people say, I've only ever seen Minus One, but that means I know what these movies should be, and they should be like Minus One and nothing else. You've seen it all at this point. The discourse has kind of gone through a rocky patch because of it. Do I think that Minus One specifically is to blame for this? Not really. It has more to do with the people who were coming into it. As I've said in the past, you can't always control what kind of audience you're going to get when you release a piece of art into the world. So Minus One just happened to get the attention of people who didn't know what they were talking about. And those people happened to get the attention of the greater fandom. That's not necessarily the movie's fault. The movie was just trying to be a good movie. Takashi Yamazaki was just trying to make the best possible Godzilla film that he could, and arguably he succeeded. he couldn't possibly have known how that was going to affect the way fans and non-fans alike would talk about it. So there have been rough patches, I'm not denying that. But does that mean the discourse has been ruined? Does it mean the discourse could never possibly recover? Well, judging partly by the fact that Godzilla Kong: The New Empire wound up being a financial success, despite everybody's predictions that it would fail because -1 was so good, I would say there is still hope that it hasn't been ruined. But I'm not basing it entirely on just that. I'm not going to have this be another movie where I just say how much fun The New Empire was. I'm keeping this focused more on the -1 side of things. And like I said, I feel like I've seen this before. I have seen instances where a movie turned out to be so incredibly good that it did have a negative impact on the discourse. And in fact, it was a franchise film I have in mind specifically. But the ruination didn't last as long as you might think, all things considered. We must journey back to the distant past in the year of our Lord 2008, when The Dark Knight was released. Some of you might not remember this because some of you might be too young, or some of you just might not have ever gotten in on the hype going on. But back in 2008, The Dark Knight was the movie. You cannot underestimate how much hype was going into this thing. Batman, of course, has always been popular. The Dark Knight is a Batman movie, and pretty much since his debut way back in the late 30s, Batman has been one of the superheroes. Consistently, from then to now, he has been the one to beat. He's practically everybody's favorite. Some consider him the most perfect superhero because, similar to Godzilla, he is very versatile, able to adapt with the times, incorporates many different elements, some might say steel, but let's not get into that, and somehow makes those elements his own, which then circles back and influences the greater popular culture where people start imitating that stuff. Basically, Batman exists in this realm where he has a tight grip on the pop culture zeitgeist. But how popular he's been has depended on certain factors. And I'm talking about mainstream popularity. Obviously, if you're a comic book fan, young or young at heart, you're going to basically at least have one Batman comic or graphic novel in your collection. But in terms of the mainstream, I mean, 30s through 50s, he was known, but comics were still considered a child's medium. And of course, there was all that stuff about the corruption of the innocent and everything. So the popularity was kept kind of on the down low. The 60s came along, Batman went mainstream with the Adam West and Burt Ward TV series that was technically comic book accurate for the time. And it was popular, people liked it, but hardcore Batman fans considered it an insult because of how campy and lighthearted it was. That has softened over the years, and I think more people have come to respect what the series was aiming for, even with its campier tone. But that's a whole other discussion. Moving forward, the campy image of Batman was what stuck in most people's minds, even as he started to get more serious through the 70s. But it wasn't until the late 80s and early 90s that Batman's popularity skyrocketed once again, thanks to the Tim Burton movie, which was, it was the movie to beat. Everybody loved it. People were going crazy over it. Thanks to that movie, we got an animated series that's considered one of the best pieces of animation ever made. And it got its own theatrical movie that nobody saw. And of course, then Batman Returns happened, which was the sequel to the Tim Burton Batman, which people weren't too thrilled with because they thought it went too dark. And then the Joel Schumacher movies came along and brought Batman back in that campy direction, and his popularity waned again. No pun intended. He still remained somewhat popular, but mostly in the niche markets, like animation, like comic books. Stuff for nerds, basically. Nerds and children. He wasn't mainstream. Not until 2005, when Christopher Nolan did the reboot Batman Begins, and also brought the word reboot into the lexicon. You didn't really hear that word applied to movies that much before Batman Begins. And it did really well. It restored Batman's status as a serious icon in the mainstream. So going into 2008, The Dark Knight was hyped in the extreme. Yeah, there was some initial skepticism when people learned that Heath Ledger was going to be cast as the Joker, because most people knew him from movies like 10 Things I Hate About You and Brokeback Mountain. They were thinking, there is no way he goes from playing a gay cowboy to playing the Clown Prince of Crime. It's impossible. He's going to blow it. And then that first trailer landed and all that skepticism vaporized. And people were just looking forward to this like they were looking forward to nothing else. And that was just the hype. When the movie actually hit theaters, it delivered on that hype. It became the biggest movie of that year, and in fact was the biggest movie of all time. And people were really into it. Like, for a brief time, it was actually considered a critic-proof movie. Critic-proof is a term you don't normally hear anymore because, let's face it, it was kind of a stupid term to begin with. But it was often applied to movies that were considered to have such a big built-in audience that there was no possible way it was going to fail, even if the critics came out and said, you know it's bad, right? The Harry Potter and Twilight movies also were considered critic-proof. And The Dark Knight wound up falling under that as well because it's a Batman movie. Well, how is Batman not going to financially succeed? And The Dark Knight was put on a pedestal like no other movie had been before. People considered it the best comic book movie of all time. Quickly, they started to consider it the best movie of all time. Not even a movie, but a film, which is a distinction I still don't understand. But it was considered that good, to the point where you could not actually critique it, or perhaps more accurately, it was believed you should not critique it. Had The Dark Knight been made today, I don't doubt that the question of whether or not it ruined the discourse would have been asked in the same way it's being asked with Minus One. People were ravenously into this movie and did not tolerate any negativity said against it. I remember there was a video that popped up a couple of years after the movie's release. And unfortunately, I don't remember who did it, or even if the video is still up, I have no idea. But I do recall that the guy who made it claimed to be a professional film editor, and he believed that The Dark Knight was not a well-edited film. And to prove his point, he did a shot-by-shot breakdown of the chase scene in the middle. The one that was filmed in IMAX, you know, where Harvey Dent is being transported, the Joker's after him, Batman's got to race after them on the Batpod, they flip the truck, you know the whole scene. Now, I watched the whole thing. I'm not entirely sure I agreed with his assessment, though I could kind of see what he was driving at, but I also read the comments, and he was getting raked over the coals by people. The popular consensus appeared to be that this guy was either a contrarian or he was just mad that he didn't get to work on such a successful and perfect movie as The Dark Knight. Either way, his video was not well received by people who believe that The Dark Knight was the most perfect of perfect films. And that's the way the narrative was for a very long time. The Dark Knight was considered so flawless that you could not say anything bad about it. And if you did say something bad about it, it wasn't really anything that mattered. Like, yeah, Christian Bale does that gravelly voice that sounds a little silly, but I mean, come on. It doesn't really have that big of an effect, so the movie still gets a 10 out of 10 for pretty much everybody, and the movie is considered perfect. That's the way it went for a long time. And of course, because of all this, DC decided that what the people wanted must be for the whole DC universe to be Nolanized, which is exactly what they did when they relaunched everything under the New 52 banner. So, yeah, there was a very clear negative impact on the discourse and the overall franchise, if you will, not just of Batman, but of DC itself. So, what happened ultimately? Well, things eventually cooled down. For starters, people saw that just because stuff worked in Batman Begins and The Dark Knight didn't necessarily mean it would work elsewhere. For example, the New 52, which was all about Nolanizing the DC universe, not popular. I don't even think it lasted 5 full years before DC redid it with the Rebirth series. Or sort of redid it, kind of. They didn't fully reset. They kept a lot of elements, but they did try to get it a little bit more away from that tone. Then, of course, The Dark Knight Rises came along, and while it's not necessarily a terrible film, there's certainly far worse comic book movies out there, it didn't land the way The Dark Knight did, or even Batman Begins. It had various contrivances and plot holes. The depiction of Bane wasn't all that popular. There were just so many things about it that people didn't like as much as those other movies. Which I guess means it was kind of fortunate it wound up being the end anyway. But you know, The Dark Knight still exists in its original form, so what happened to all the fervor? What happened to the frothy madness people spoke about this movie with? Well, as time passed, the fervor just sort of naturally simmered. People's opinions of the movie didn't change. A lot of people still consider it to be peak cinema, but they're not necessarily going to be as obsessed about it, I guess you could say. They're going to say they like it, but they're not going to say you must like it. And of course, this calming of nerves also coincided with the natural expansion of commentary on the internet, where more and more people figured out how to post blogs and videos and dared to say stuff that went against the grain. Stuff like that they maybe liked the Star Wars prequel trilogy, or that The Dark Knight isn't that perfect. And by that point, people weren't as passionate about arguing in favor of it anymore. The narrative already stood, of course, but there were more people who were open to the idea of hearing others out and thinking, you know, maybe it does have a few things that could have been better. Now, don't get the wrong impression. I like The Dark Knight too. I'm not ravenous about it, but I do like it. I'm not gonna start going off on it in any capacity here. But I'm bringing it up to say that I've seen it happen. The Dark Knight was considered the best of anything, and for a while there, you could say it ruined the discourse and had a negative impact on the overall franchise, but that only lasted so long. For proof of this, you need look no further than how people responded to The Batman, with quite a few of them saying that it was their new favorite Batman movie, even better than The Dark Knight, at least for now anyway. The point is, stuff calmed down. And I think it's going to calm down with -1 as well. It might already be in the process, in fact. I've seen people say that the discourse was ruined, and yes, there was definitely that period, beginning with Dr. Skipper, where we saw a whole influx of people coming in and pretending that they knew what was best for these movies, despite having never bothered with them before. And some people latched their wagons onto them and thought, yeah, these guys are totally right. Other people opposed them with everything they had. But it's gonna pass. -1 certainly is not going to lose its status as a great movie, I don't think. It's proved itself, certainly. It's got everything you could want out of a well-made film. So people are still going to mostly be speaking positively of it in the days to come. But the negative impact that this discussion has had, it will pass. The people who are the tourists, basically, they're gonna move on. Once they've said their piece about -1, they're going to just go back to talking about Ghostbusters or Marvel or whatever else is popular at the time. The fandom itself will certainly still have its back and forth about the quality of different eras and different individual films, but it's not going to remain predicated on -1 versus the Monsterverse, or -1 versus Shin, or -1 versus Heisei, or anything. It's going to eventually level out, as all things wind up doing in these sorts of scenarios. So, did Godzilla -1 ruin the discourse? No, I don't think so. It did have a bit of an impact where things took a swerve into negative territory, but things are swerving back. And eventually, we'll just be able to have our discourses the way we usually do. However that may wind up being. And that's my stance on the matter. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. Thank you all for watching. Now be sure to head down to the description to check us out on other platforms, as well as find links to the 5 current books in the Tales from the Omni Vault universe. Again, thank you all, and we'll see you next time.